The Korean War was fought between North Korea and South Korea from 1950 to 1953. The North was supported by the Communists in China and the Soviet Union, while the South was supported by the United States and the United Nations, with many soldiers being sent to Korea to help defeat the Communists. At the outbreak of war in the Korean Peninsula in 1950, the United Nations sent a plea to its member nations for military assistance. Many countries contributed men to fight in Korea, such as the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. However, a little-known fact is that the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, pledged to dispatch an infantry battalion to Korea known as the Kagnew Battalion. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie had seen firsthand the terror of communist and fascist ideologies employed against his homeland. Benito Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Italy, led a brutal campaign from 1935 to 1941, which forced Selassie to go into exile. Selassie condemned the League of Nations for its inability to respond and felt betrayed by the United Kingdom's efforts to control Ethiopia's resources. Following his country's occupation and the regaining of its independence, Selassie formulated his quest for new allies in the West on a U.S. warship off the coast of Egypt in 1945. This is where President Franklin Roosevelt and Selassie discussed opening a port in Djibouti. When the United Nations requested its support 5 years later, Selassie called upon his very best troops. He ordered 5 battalions from his Ethiopian Imperial Bodyguard to combine and become the Kagnew Battalion. The Imperial Bodyguard Division was the most elite military force in the Ethiopian Empire, with responsibility for safeguarding the royal household and maintaining internal security. Therefore, the battalions destined to Korea were drawn mostly from the officers and men of the Imperial Bodyguard Division. They were then given intensive training in the mountains of Ethiopia to become acclimated to the Korean climate. Despite training in the Ethiopian highlands for 8 months prior to their arrival, nothing could have prepared the soldiers for the harsh winter environment they were thrust into. It was very cold, said Sergeant Asfau Abebe, noting when they first arrived they hadn't been issued the proper cold weather gear. Only our eyes were visible and everything else was covered. There is no other country with more snow than Korea, he said. When they arrived in Korea, they were viewed with a degree of skepticism by American officers, probably because they were the only country in Africa to contribute troops and Americans weren't familiar with their reputation. While American troops were still overcoming desegregation among its ranks, the Ethiopians valued merit over skin color. Quote, "You know Ethiopia has a 3,000-year history as an independent country," said Captain Mamo Habtold, a Kagnew Battalion soldier who fought in 1953. "We Ethiopians were proud and boasting that we were Ethiopians. We don't care about any color. The Americans didn't call us Negro as we would be angry," he said. Many felt the Ethiopians should be placed in rear areas instead of on the front line, but the Ethiopians insisted on being in the heat of battle with their American counterparts. So they were assigned to the American 7th Division, a decorated army division best known for their deployment in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese in World War II. Things were not easy. The Ethiopian soldiers could not speak English, were unfamiliar with American army tactics, and many were weary of Western doctors. After several weeks of training near Busan, the Kagnew Battalion was sent north to the front, and within days the unit distinguished itself in combat. The Ethiopian soldiers soon gained a reputation for maneuvering through the shadows and fighting in the dark. It was like they were ghosts to the enemy, leading to the Chinese fearing them. Perhaps even more alarming were the rumors of cannibalism by the Ethiopians, who would eat raw meat in front of their prisoners, suggesting they would eat them if they got out of line. Of course, these rumors were false, but they only made the Kagnew Battalion even more terrifying to the enemy, who had little to no contact with Africans prior to the war. The Kagnew Battalion fought in 253 battles in the areas of Pork Chop Hill, T-Bone, and Old Baldy. All 121 Ethiopian soldiers who were killed were brought home alongside an additional 536 wounded. The Chinese and North Korean soldiers were frustrated that they weren't ever able to find the corpses of the Ethiopian soldiers they killed. This is because individual Ethiopian soldiers volunteered to retrieve the bodies of their fallen comrades, even if that meant facing heavy gunfire from the enemy. The Kagnew Battalion never left a man behind, wounded or dead, and none of their soldiers were ever captured by the North Koreans or Chinese. According to S.L.A. Marshall, a chief U.S. Army combat historian during World War II and the Korean War, Quote, Ethiopians were the only contingent that had no prisoners to collect from the North Koreans, since Kagnew's soldiers never surrendered. They had the additional distinctions of having won every single battle they fought in. The Kagnew Battalion's motto was, "Never be captured on the warfield." They served with great distinction alongside the 7th Infantry Division, and by all accounts, including the enemy's, acquitted themselves well in battle. A specific instance of the battalion's heroics happened one night in May 1953. Habtewold led a small patrol composed of 14 Ethiopians and 1 American. As they peeked over the hilltop to scout the area below, they came under heavy fire from a massive Chinese force. An estimated 300 Chinese assaulters surrounded their position, outnumbering them 20 to 1. 3 Ethiopians and the lone American were immediately killed. A Chinese soldier tried to ambush a radio operator and take him hostage. However, Habtewold killed the soldier with his rifle and rescued his teammate. He attempted to call for reinforcements and artillery fire, but his radio had been damaged. Habtewold was hit several times and fainted twice from blood loss as the fighting progressed through the night. With a pistol in his hand, he would have rather committed suicide than fall into the enemy's grasp. After passing out for a 3rd time, he was down to a single hand grenade, and without a working radio, he knew they were going to be overrun. He decided to look for a working radio and would shoot any Chinese soldier he saw, and when it got quiet, he would go back to looking for the radio. He ventured out into the open, picking up rifles and ammunition from the enemy who lay dying, and maneuvered towards the position of one of his radio operators. He retrieved his lifeline, and through broken English, he provided battlefield coordinates to the Americans waiting on standby. The artillery pummeled the hill, stopping the Chinese advances. As the artillery kept Chinese heads down, reinforcements soon arrived under the cover of smoke grenades and helped rescue his patrol. Habtewold was awarded Ethiopia's highest medal for valor, and the U.S. military awarded him the Silver Star, the 3rd highest medal for valor in combat. At least 9 Silver Star medals and dozens of Bronze Star medals were awarded to the Ethiopians by the United States. When the U.S. established a military base in the newly federated Eritrea in 1953, they renamed the base Kagnew Station in honor of the officers and men who served so admirably in Korea. When the communist group of Mengistu Haile Mariam came to power in 1974, it did everything to erase the record of the Kagnew's service against the communists. Because they were communists themselves, they were embarrassed by the history of the Kagnew Battalion, removing the story from Ethiopian history textbooks and classrooms. The Imperial Bodyguard Association still existed quietly, however, and continued to celebrate the accomplishments of the officers and men not only of the Kagnew Battalion, but of the Guard at large. Since the events of the Korean War, many of the Ethiopian soldiers have had the opportunity to visit Korea and be remembered for their service, as well as thanked for their heroic action.